What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back with the team at Awesemo, talking some college football DFS. We are winding down the season here. It is January the 4th, and we have a single game slate on our hands, Kansas State versus LSU. But before we get into this, make sure to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. Bringing you to the game. A very interesting one, our last bowl game before the national championship. Kansas State, they are a 5-point favorite over LSU, 48-point total. Kansas State's taking some money, so I've seen this get close to 7 in some spots. As a betting man, I think maybe taking the points with LSU is where I would lean, but there's still so much uncertainty in the game that's probably just a stay away for me. And the total a little bit lower here. A lot of that because Kansas State is the slowest team in all of football. That is not an exaggeration. They rank 130 in pace among FBS teams. They're also fairly run heavy, just a 44% pass rate. LSU is the exact opposite, 73 plays per game, 53.5% pass rate for them, but obviously a lot of transfers, NFL draft opt-outs for the Tigers. So that suggests to me that Kansas State, the more veteran team here, has the edge. But again, that's already reflected in the spread. But for DFS purposes, we have Skyler Thompson expected to start the bowl game for Kansas State. He is fairly expensive in the captain spot. Was a little surprised to see that. He actually checked in with negative rushing yards. And this is a guy that rushed for over 1,000 yards combined in his first 3 years at Kansas State. So very mobile. So I was very surprised to see that he actually finished with negative rushing yards. Again, Skyler was hurt a lot this year, so he didn't have the full sample we normally see with him. And maybe the injuries affected his mobility, but he did not use his legs. But we know that he has that ability at least. And he's going to need to use it if you roster him because Kansas State is so slow and so run heavy that Thompson only averaged 23 attempts per game. He was efficient and still able to average over 200 yards per game. But that's just not a tournament winning ceiling if he's not running. So if you roster Skyler, you do need the rushing ability. But overall, he's sort of a high floor, low ceiling upside option right now in the captain spot, given what he's done this year. In the run game, Deuce Vaughn is the best player on the slate. Supposedly playing in the game, he averages over 100 rushing yards per game. He's the team's most targeted receiver. He actually is 3 yards behind Phillip Brooks for the lead in yards in terms of receiving. So this guy's a do-it-all player for Kansas State. He'll be extremely involved, but that's not reflected in price. If you do play him at the captain spot, you have to make some concessions, and I do think that influences your lineup. The question shouldn't be whether to roster Deuce Vaughn or not, but where to roster him. Right now, I'm leaning in the flex, but I certainly am going to have captain lineups with Vaughn as well, just punting other places. But he might see even more work, like Joe Irving transferred. A lot of these guys are gone. So Deuce Vaughn just locked into the role. Receiving game, Phillip Brooks and Malik Knowles are going to be the two players to watch here. Most targeted receivers, Brooks has more yards. He has more targets. He averages more yards per game, more targets per game. And for some reason, he's cheaper than Knowles. So in a vacuum, Phillip Brooks makes more sense. On FanDuel, it's the opposite. Knowles is a little cheaper here. So that FanDuel actually has slightly better pricing for these guys. But on DraftKings, shocked to see Brooks so cheap compared to Knowles. Still, it's a low volume passing attack, so neither of these guys is super enticing. In the receiving game, outside of them, Landry Weber is going to split time with Tyrone Howell as the wide receiver 3. Sammy Wheeler and Daniel Amadarbebe are going to split time at tight end. None of these guys are particularly involved. Their targets, yards, pretty similar across the board. Sammy Wheeler's been really involved of late, averaging 3 targets per game over the last 4. But his snaps and routes haven't drastically eclipsed Amadarbebe. So you could see this flip at any time. They're all risky, but you can punt with some of these guys in tournaments overall. LSU, Max Johnson hits the portal, leaving Garrett Nussmeier as the projected starting quarterback. LSU's been a disaster all year, obviously losing their head coach Orgeron at the end of the year. They lose Johnson to transfer after he was grossly mismanaged. And speaking of mismanagement, Garrett Nussmeier, the freshman's already played 4 games. So now LSU's trying to petition the NCAA to allow him to play in this game and not burn the red shirt because they don't have viable alternatives. I don't see that happening. LSU just messed up playing him 4 games already. It's their fault. So he's still listed as the starter, so it appears they're comfortable burning the red shirt either way. No idea what's going to happen here. But if Nussmeier does start, he's at least a little better than the other options they have. Nussmeier, he has played a little bit this year. He hasn't shown any competence as a quarterback, really. He's taken a bunch of sacks, 5 of them for negative 46 yards, and he hasn't offset that with any positive rushing ability, which is a major concern But as a passer, he's still playing in an offense that's really high volume. They're going to run a lot of plays. I don't know if they keep the pass rate this high with the young signal caller or if they drop it down a little bit, but historically this team has thrown the ball a lot over the last 3 years, so he could backdoor his way into some production. But man, it's risky. And without him, you're probably looking at some combination of Matt O'Dode or, like a Tavion Falk starting at quarterback. If they don't use Nussmeier, I'm not sure who they play, and they probably rotate. Those guys are just depth pieces and not expected to play in normal circumstances. In the backfield, Tyrion Davis-Price also opted out. He was the lead back, vacates 19 touches per game. You also saw Armani Goodwin and Trey Bradford left off the depth chart. That doesn't necessarily mean they're out, but it is concerning that they weren't even on the top 3 positions listed. Corey Kiner was the top back on the depth chart. 65 carries on the year for him, 3 targets, 270 yards. He's easily the most active rusher among people that are still on the roster. Josh Williams has been involved a little bit of late as a change of pace, 16 carries on the year, 6 of those carries coming in the last 3 games. He also is a little bit more active as a receiver. As you can see, he does have 7 targets on the year, and that could be a role he occupies with Kiner being more of the early down back. So I think they're both active in this game. Josh Williams, pretty decent play at the Stone Min. Kiner's actually a pretty good play as well because we have seen LSU embrace the run down the stretch. Davis-Price had at least 19 carries in 4 straight games. So if Kiner just fills in that role with a young QB, there could be a lot of value here, even as dogs. And then Corin Norman was listed as the running back 3. At the very most, he's just a change of pace. He only had 1 carry on the year. The receivers. So we lost Kayshon Boutte very early on in the year to injury. We've now seen a lot of players transfer. Trey Palmer, his transfer is the most impactful. And again, doesn't necessarily mean he won't play, but not expecting him to. He's a guy that averaged 5.5 targets over the last 4 games. So Trey Palmer leaving does condense the target share here. You also had players like Coy Moore transfer. Those guys don't play as much, so those are less impactful. But with Trey Palmer out of the picture, this should condense LSU's receiving core to 3 main receivers and 1 tight end. The tight end is Jack Beck. He's actually a little cheap compared to his role in offense. He's the team's leading receiver outside of Boutte, averages 5.6 targets per game. He's extremely active as a tight end. But since Boutte went down, we've seen Jere Jenkins take on a larger role. So on the year, Jenkins actually has less receiving yards, less targets than Beck. But if you isolate the last 4 games, Jenkins has more targets. He's out-targeted to him 25 to 22 in that span. So even with that, it's not really a sizable difference. So seeing Beck at 9,600, Jere Jenkins at 12,600, that's a pretty wide price gap for players that really don't have that different of a role here. I think it's mostly the last game of the year where Beck had 2 targets and Jenkins had 12 that's skewing this. But Beck, I think, is a good value on both slates. Jenkins is the safest option if you're willing to pay for him. He does provide security. The wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 are going to be Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas was injured down the stretch, but he's now had a month to recover. He should be fine. These guys have basically the same role on offense. They are separated by 4 targets on the year. Neighbors has about 56 more receiving yards, but again, Thomas has been injured, and he actually sat through part of games, so it appears he was active but limited, and that was because of injury, not because of performance. Still, Neighbors is more involved of late, 5 targets per game to 4 targets per game for Thomas. But again, this comes down to price. You're getting Thomas at a much cheaper role. Neighbors, I think, being more expensive than Beck is even a little surprising here. And again, that comes down to their most recent game, 9 targets for Neighbors, 2 for Beck. But overall, Beck and Thomas are good values if you want to pay up. Neighbors and Jere Jenkins are the other 2 receivers. And you're probably not going to see that many more. Again, Palmer transferred, Deion Smith transferred, Boutte's injured. Just a lot of people are gone from this LSU team. But that'll do it for us today. Let me know in the comment section who your favorite plays are. I'm Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Thank you guys for watching. We'll be back for the national championship game. Have a good one.